that the actual project isn't relevant to you sitting there because you might not be interested in changing something the same, you know, on the same topic that we were in our school. But the actual process is the really important thing. So maybe when I'm speaking, you think about the thing in your school that you would like to change, and maybe how the process would allow you to do that.
If you just use the arrow, I think that's really good. That one, yeah. Oh, is it hung up?
Seems to be the same today, doesn't it? I'll let you be my technician now, Karen.
I'm just pressing the button,
Okay, so in our school we decided, like Lynn said, I'm the assistant principal and my area of responsibility is teaching and learning. So I have lots of conversations with people about the quality of their lessons. And my itch, if you like, was, thank you, boring lessons and lots of teacher talk in lessons and watching students do not as much as what they might be doing. And the teacher's itch was that the students in our school were too dependent. So we sat around with a group of staff and had a conversation about what would you do to guarantee that when you get to the end of sixth form you're really, really dependent and you can't do any research for yourself and you can't study on your own and you can't go out and find answers for yourself. And we were doing all those things. We were spoon feeding our students and we were really guaranteeing that they wouldn't be independent by the time they left us. However, on paper we've got a fantastic competency curriculum that solves all of those problems and we've had it for quite a few years and we have got a really interesting curriculum, but day in, day out in every single lesson that wasn't really happening. It was happening maybe for an hour for some year groups in some learn lessons. So it was really starting to frustrate the teachers. Obviously, it's not exactly an unusual story, is it? But we've done launches of learn to learn and competency and things like this over and over and over. So we decided we need to change how we're doing it. So becoming an inquiry school meant that we were able to clearly identify what it is that we were aiming to do. And it's never just changing one thing, isn't it? So we were creating these more independent students, but we were also looking at quite a few other areas across school, and obviously it's difficult to separate things. But these were our priorities. We knew that we were going to be introducing iPads to Key Stage 3 students, so we knew that that was something that we had to address. We knew that we needed to look at this independence in and outside of structured curriculum time. So how does what you're doing in the classroom train your students how to work in their free time? And really importantly, we were looking at joint practice development and all of our professional development in school, and like what's just been referred to, what do we spend a lot of money on and what do we spend time and energy on that produces absolutely nothing. Probably doing this after school to people on a Monday evening for 3 hours. You don't want to sit there listening to it. You certainly don't want to be standing up delivering it knowing full well nobody wants to listen to what you're saying, and actually you'd rather than go away and plan some amazing lessons. So we knew we had to look at professional development. I digress, sorry. So this is our visualisation. This is where we wanted to get to. I was discussing this presentation earlier on this morning, and I actually said, when I use this slide in front of quite a lot of our staff, they said, yeah, that's what we do. That's what we do all that. And it's like, well, we don't, do we? Because otherwise, the outcomes would be much stronger than they are. We attempt to do some of these things, but we're not quite where we want to be. But this is where we wanted to get to. So, becoming an inquiry school meant that we ended up working on a project after quite a few false starts, I would like to add, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But we started working on something that became known as the Live Project. At the same time, we set up an iGenius group of staff and students. That was 4 different control groups that were getting us ready for introducing iPads. And we also had a Learning Spaces project going on, which was looking at how we use space outside of classrooms to enable more learning to happen outside of structured curriculum time. The reason I'll tell you about those is because they all cross over throughout their journeys. But by far this was the most successful one. Ooh. And it's because we use this. And this is the part where I know I'm going to start to feel a little bit like I'm doing a sales pitch. But it's just really, really simple, and and it worked. So we went through the Inquiry in Schools toolkit, and becoming an inquiry in school meant that I got introduced to a lady called Liz Hankin, who became our Inquiry in Schools facilitator or coach, or I can't remember. She has a quite posh title, I think, doesn't she? Facilitator. But really, she should be called Saint Liz, because every now and again she sends you an email to give you a nudge, or you look in your diary and you know that you've got a meeting. And it's not a meeting that you dread, but it's a meeting that you think, oh, she's going to ask me some challenging questions and I need to be ready to answer those questions. So it just introduces that discipline. So before you even get to the stage where she starts nudging you and asking you the tricky questions, you have to take your bearings, which is obviously what we did, and we visualised where we wanted to get to. And it was really important at this point that Liz would say to me, you're asking the questions and you don't need to have the answers, because I, obviously being in the culture of writing improvement plans, etc., in school, thought that I had to know everything, how I was going to get there. And I didn't at all. And that was the best thing I did. I didn't have any of the answers, but I went to the staff that I knew had the frustrations and had the problems, obviously. So taking where we are, visualising your destination, establishing exactly where we are and where we need to get to. Okay, establishing base camp. It sounds really straightforward. Obviously that's the process you would go through. But you don't in a school, because your real job, your day-to-day stuff, your firefighting all gets in the way and doesn't allow you to do that, and you get to certain deadlines and just go, oh right, well we'll just do this bit because we've run out of time because it has to be finished this report next week, or whatever it is. Going through the process means that it doesn't happen. Going through a school day or a school year just means that it just doesn't happen, and I don't think that's just me. There's people sitting there nodding. So going through this process and going through the Inquiry in Schools process is what makes it work, in my opinion, because our other two projects were really successful and we got there, but in a bit more of a painful way is probably the best way of describing it. A few more panic moments and not having the structure to go back and forth between each stage. So much so that the two staff that ended up working on this project were two teachers in their second year of teaching, and we just got them to start from scratch really, what works, what doesn't work in the classroom, and they had to make all of the decisions. I won't talk through the whole process of what they did, because it's too long-winded, but it has changed how we look at professional development in the school, because from listening to them speak, you would think they've been speaking 10 years. They're so reflective now in terms of how they approach all of their planning and what goes on in the classroom. It was really rather impressive listening to the journey that they've been through and the impact that it's had on those two staff. It means that this process really now is our blueprint for any professional development in school. The head teacher decided to sort of put out a proposal to staff that they could apply to do action research, and obviously they will go through this process because he's seen how powerful it is to bring about change. And it's obvious, isn't it, if somebody invests in it, it's theirs. Okay, when it gets really risky and really wobbly and the students' grades drop, and they did, they've got this structure and they've got this safety net, if you like, to still keep going with the project. Whereas if I would have come along and just said to somebody, this is what we're doing now because I've written it down on the plan, they're not going to do it when the results are riding on it, and they're not going to do it when it feels like it's getting really difficult. So it was really important that the staff had to own the project and that they become familiar with this. So this has become our blueprint for bringing about change and having professional development, but not in a forced way. It's just seeping into the culture of the school, of people saying this is obviously the logical way to go through things. Has anybody got any questions? Because obviously I've not outlined the actual project that we went through, which you can do maybe later. As the process grew, we never set out for it to be pupil-led. We never set out with knowing exactly what it was going to look like at the end, which obviously I've already referred to. As it grew in quite a structured way and started to take on a life of its own almost, it did become a pupil-led programme. And because the staff had this safety net, and because it was so structured, it allowed for us to start having offshoots of quite a small project, but still in quite a controlled way. Does that make sense? So out of one project grew something else where the students started to train our staff we had a group of general staff. It just sounds like a bit of a gimmick, and why would you do that, and why would you set out to do that? But it just worked because it just evolved as the project went through. So it started being quite an innovative practice that was working really successfully with really, really small amount of effort, it has to say. It wasn't heavy workload. So the end result is, obviously I've mentioned quite a bit about professional development. The end result is we've changed our learning spaces in the school. We've changed quite a lot of practice that goes on inside of lessons, or I have not, as the individual teachers have, but also because of how the students were working and because of what was coming back from the students of how they learn best in real terms of actually saying, I failed this piece of work, or this wasn't my best piece of work because X, Y, and Z, rather than, yeah, I like working in teams, and yeah, I like working with my friends, and no superficial conversations, real conversations about why something was successful, why it wasn't. We changed spaces within the school. So we're really fortunate in our school, we've got fantastic facilities, yet it wasn't meeting the needs of all of the pupils. So they want somewhere quiet to go and sit on their own to be able to study. They don't want to do it in a big environment where everybody else is. They want to be able to share things. This is just a TV on the wall that's got an Apple TV attached to it because they want to be able to present things to small groups of students, and when they worked in that way it was successful. So it's anecdotal, but it has brought about real change that is definitely going to be sustained throughout the school. Any questions? Okay.
Just, yeah, I'm going to ask a question, because you said in the middle of that, you had to be brave because initially some results went down. I think you meant to end that sentence.
The results went back up. Obviously, is the thing. The project included a year 8 class, a very able year 8 class with an English teacher that was struggling to know how to challenge the students. And the other group was a year 10 class with a teacher that was struggling with relationships with the students. She had the naughty boys, and she was a new teacher to the school, and she was like, how do I establish this relationship and get the results? You know, I haven't got time to do the groundwork that I need to do. So throughout the academic year with both classes, the year 8 class of high achievers, the results dipped slightly in the middle of the year, and the year 10 students stayed the same, but in comparison to the other year 10 class, they were much lower. The year 8 students went down and then went back up. We allowed them to fail, which is something that we don't usually do. Obviously, again, probably a familiar story. The results did go back up. At that moment when they dropped, if we weren't part of the structured programme, I'm quite confident, 100% confident in saying we would have abandoned it, because we wouldn't have had the structure and the support to say, no, let's keep going, let's ride it out. And I felt that I could sit in front of the principal with confidence and say, let's keep going. Yeah, short-term loss, long-term gain, let's do it. And obviously, that's a gamble and you take a risk. But we felt like we were taking a risk anyway. If we kept teaching those high achievers in the same way, not challenging them, that wasn't going to work. And if we kept teaching the naughty boys in the same way, that wasn't going to work. And the gamble paid off. But I definitely think at that point, usually, we jumped ship.
What did you just in thinking, purely because I'm curious, what did you tell the parents when the results went down? Because I can just imagine the phone calls I get from people saying.
Completely. And I had an English teacher in her second year of teaching, really, really nervous, genuinely sort of sleepless night stuff about parenting, because she was just saying, you know, on our reports every half term it goes out to students. These students have got a red for underachieving, they've never had a red on their report before. And fortunately, this was good timing, but by the time parents evening came, they'd started to go back in, not back to where they should be, but they started to creep back up. The parents completely backed us. Once they knew what the project was about, and the parents had been informed about the life project and what the students were doing, once the parents knew that we were trying to develop the other skills and explaining what we were almost trying to prevent from happening to these able pupils, they absolutely backed us. And we were fortunate, I suppose, because the results went back up within the same academic year. Because obviously that individual teacher, she wasn't just scared about the parents, she was scared of the head of department. and yeah, it was going. But
I think it's also helpful to be engaged with the evidence base. So we do know from a lot of evidence that kids who can self-manage and kids who are reflective and medical, are better learners. But it was having that, using the evidence base to give you the confidence to say that's how we can write this. They're not used to doing that. Suddenly we're expecting them to manage themselves, expecting them to be more reflective and self-improving. But it is the evidence base is a bit of a safety net as well, maybe, to sort of give you the confidence to say, yeah, we need to persist.
the interesting thing then was those same students going to other lessons. They did this in their English lesson, going to the history lessons, and actually, miss, this isn't how I'm going to do my best. What I really need to do is. So then, obviously, you're getting your staff on board in a completely different way.
Could you give us like a concrete example of what one of these lessons might have been like? Take an hour of their time when they go into it after you started this live project. What was different?
So the live project meant that the students were deciding how they would learn each lesson. So in the beginning it was them turning up to the lesson, and the teacher might have the objective or the big question or whatever it was they wanted to achieve. She'd have a range of resources that you might need, and she'd say to the students, over to you. So it was really, really open at the beginning. As we went through the process and the two teachers worked together, they brought that back a little bit. So half of the lesson might be over to the students and half of the lesson to the teacher might be what you would describe in a more traditional sense of the teaching. So I use the Year 8 English one for an example. In a typical lesson, is that what you mean with the process? A typical lesson, they might turn up and they might know that they're working towards a speaking and listening assessment, and they know the criteria that they're working towards, like they would in any other situation. And 4 students might say, I'm going to go and work in the media suite, and I'm going to prepare this as though I'm a newsreader with a specific article for a target audience. And somebody else might say, well, actually, I'm still at my research stage, and the thing I really want to speak about, I don't know anything about, so can I grab an iPad and go and work somewhere quietly on my own? And if I need you, I will come back to you to support. So there'll be a variety of tasks going on in sort of all sorts of different ways, however the students wanted to work.
And what sort of intervention did you do if students, because presumably some of them must have taken advantage of that to do nothing.
Yeah.
So at what point did the teacher intervene with the student and say, you're not doing the right thing?
Yeah. It was quite structured in the way it was introduced. They knew that they were part of an experiment. They signed up to a learning agreement, which obviously they signed away because they know that they're going to be released from the classroom. And the characters that you would expect, have a good wander around school and see who they can distract and what they can get up to. That soon stopped when they were getting the negative feedback, when they were getting the red mark or they were getting the low mark. What we found was it didn't last that long, okay? And there was restrictions put on. So the Year 10 class had some real characters in there. So on their Friday afternoon class, it very, very quickly became apparent that they couldn't cope with that freedom on the last lesson of a Friday afternoon. So that lesson became a more traditional lesson in the classroom, and they had 2 out of 3 lessons doing that. The behaviour thing didn't really happen like we almost prepared for it. All we ended up in a situation was our staff conference room was always booked because the students were always emailing to book it and we could never get in there because they just told us that they liked working at a big round table. Funnily enough, they didn't find it helpful working in the classroom with rows. Really simple, obvious things. Just conscious of time. Sorry.
I'm sure there'll be chances to continue talking to Anna afterwards. I should wrap up, so we're out of time. That's been fantastic. So that experience of having that support, that kind of framework to work through, to try new things, to test out whether they're working, having that Saint Liz, who's that person who asks the challenging questions and kind of leads you through that. That's brilliant. So Inquiring Schools is just one of the things the Future Lab, which NFVR are doing to support schools to conduct their own research, to innovate, to do new things. And we're also launching a research mark today, which is an accreditation which enables you to kind of basically be known as a school that's engaged in research, and there's someone who comes, that it's not just some bit of kind of report that sits on a website on a shelf somewhere and that no one reads or pays any attention to. So I'm leading our efforts to try and do things differently, work more closely with teachers and schools, so that the research that we do actually is useful and therefore has an impact, hence have an impact. So that's me. Has everyone had a chance to fill in bits of paper? Are we doing all right on that? Now I shall begin. So, at FER we've got this survey we run called Teacher Voice. It's a panel of teachers who we can send out a survey to on a regular basis, and they can fill in whatever question we set for them. It's kind of like a phone a friend on a slightly bigger scale. So recently we asked them, actually, where is it that you go when you want to access a piece of research? There isn't a hitchhiker's guide to research. Any ideas what the most common answer that teachers gave in terms of where they go to access research? Wikipedia. Anyone else?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Test.
Yeah, okay. Any other guesses? Okay. Well, the top answer that we got was that they go to a search engine. So Google. So Wikipedia, that wasn't far off. So the Hitchhiker's Guide to Research isn't a manual, it's not a book, it is Google. So I thought I would do a bit of research of my own. I thought I'd try and find out a bit more about this evidence-based practice that everyone's talking about. Has anyone ever come across Google's Ngram app that you can use? Has anyone heard of that? No, it's amazing. You've got to try it out when you go home tonight. So what Google have done, in their infinite power and wisdom, is they've taken all the books that have ever been written in English and they've digitised them. What that means you can then do is you can search these books for anything. And the more you think about it, the more exciting it gets about all the different things you look at and trends over time, over many years. So I decided I'd type in the phrase evidence-based practice, see what comes up. So any guesses when the phrase evidence-based practice first appeared in the books that Google have digitised in the English language? Was it last year? Was it 100 years ago? What was it? I should say that they've gone back to something silly like 1800. It's not just since the internet appeared. So it goes back a long period of time. When did evidence-based practice first appear?
1834.
1834? Any rises on that bid?
No one want to know about science. The same things have been happening for the last 120 years, so yeah, 1900 and something. Okay.
Anyone else? So you're all well ahead of the curve then, because it's not quite that old. In terms of the specific phrase, evidence-based practice, first appeared in the early 90s. So clearly people have been talking about this stuff for a very long time, but that specific phrase appeared in the early 90s. So what we have here, this is the percentage of all phrases that are ever used ever that are evidence-based practice. So it's 0.0000 something like percent. But there's a clear trend. It's come from apparently nowhere, and everyone's talking about it. This also only goes up to 2008. So I wonder what's happened since. Whether that levelling off has done that, or whether it's done that. Something happened in 1996. Professor David Hargreaves gave a speech to the Teacher Training Agency about evidence-based practice, and many see that as kind of launching basically where we've got to today, essentially. That's where it all began. Ofsted did a report, the Tooley report, in 1998, where they were critiquing educational research, and again they were talking about very similar things. So this isn't new, it's not a new problem, but we're all here today to talk about it. Now we heard a bit earlier from Ben Goldacre, and he was talking about, he talked about his paper he did for DFE, this prize that's there for the teaching profession to grasp, if only they can take on board evidence-based practice, or evidence-informed practice, perhaps. I prefer that phrase. So there's this pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, better outcomes for young people, wrestling practice away from the politicians or the fads or whatever else that that is kind of trying to grapple for your attention, and instead teachers being empowered to make the best choices as professionals in their practice and for their pupils. So is this pot of gold there for the taking, or is it just a mirage? Because we've been talking about it for a very long time. There have been all sorts of initiatives down the years. There was 40 million spent on the teaching and learning research programme, for example. And I'm sure that did lots of great stuff, but it's not brought about this system-wide change that, again, Ben Goldacre talked about earlier. We're still having these conversations. At NFER, this is something we're taking seriously. This is a problem we're serious about tackling. We've just been doing a literature review. I recognise the irony that we're doing it's a literature review into knowledge mobilisation, how teachers use research. So it's a piece of research into research about research. Maybe there's something missing there, I don't know. But it's a starting point. And one of the main things that's come through from this literature review, we're going to be reporting in the coming weeks. We're kind of in the middle of analysing it at the moment. But it's this idea of two worlds. There's the research profession, which sits over here, and can very easily, we can just kind of have our heads in, that's an interesting question, this is a nice bit of methodology, what's the point? Or there's the teaching profession over here, which maybe haven't seen research as relevant or useful, or have found it difficult to maybe even access research. And there's these two worlds, and the challenge is bringing them together in a way that doesn't look like that, with explosions and horrible things. So that's one of the main things that we're finding. There are things that can change on the part of the research community. There are things that can change on the part of the teaching community. We want to make that pot of gold a reality and not just the mirage which kind of disappears off when the next big thing we all get together to talk about. There's clearly, we're here on a Saturday, there's 400, 500 of us, and we're all interested in it. I'm going to stop talking now. I'm a researcher. It can't just be about me and us and the world I come from. I'm going to hand over to first Gareth and then to Emma. Emma is an assistant principal, is that right, at Accrington Academy, and has some kind of frontline experience in dealing with some of these challenges. So over to Gareth first, who runs our leads our Inquiry in Schools programme for Future Lab at NFER, and has been working with Emma over the last year or two. So, Gareth.
Thank you, Ben. The world's colliding.
Sorry to interrupt. Can we have your bits of paper? I was supposed to say that.
Could you send them this way?
We send them all down this end of the room. Otherwise, we won't do anything interesting. That's great, thank you.
I've been around for a long, long time, working with schools, thinking about promoting innovation and change. And sometimes when we talk about research, it seems as though the problem we're wrestling with is one of communication. If only people knew that smoking was bad for you, we'd all give up, wouldn't we? The fact is, you can make a research, we can understand things about research, but actually human beings are strange, they're weird and wonderful, and they behave in all sorts of different ways. So for me, we've developed a program that tries to get into not just let's think about research and engage in research, but let's think about the way human beings are, the way human beings change their behaviour and things like this. Because the issue, I think, about change and innovation is much around behaviour, attitudes and mindsets. So I put a few things out. Most innovation fails because we forget we're dealing with people. Well done. Excellent. This is good stuff because it says most innovation succeeds because we remember we're dealing with people. Right, and that's something really weird about people, I think. Systems, and anybody who's worked in schools will know this, are quite easy to change. Guess what? We've got a brand new template for planning we're going to introduce. You're smiling already. Like I said, you're being a brand new thing. We can change those things. We're going to mark in this way now. And they're fairly easy to implement. But whether or not they give you a big bang for your buck is a different question, because this stuff, emotion, habit, culture, these are difficult things to change. And so I looked for my guidance to a song that was a hit for Bananarama. It's actually written in the 1930s. It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. Do you remember that song, anybody? Young enough for that? Or old enough? Well, it was,